The Black Myths podcast is an informative conversational show analyzing popular myths about Black culture of a socio-political nature.
Translation, we just debunking the bull that be said about Black people. All right, welcome to the Black Myths podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. Here today with my co-host, Tyrell. What's up, man?
Yo, what's going on?
What up? As people can see, we rotate in and out. So Tyrell's gonna be here with us to break this down. We've covered so far in our series, Black Myths of Black History. We're collaborating with the Center of Black Literature and Culture and the Indianapolis Public Library. In our series so far, Black Myths of Black History, we have covered the Malcolm X movie is accurate, that being a myth, and I think we debunked that well. And we have also covered the talented 10th and just the various myths around what that meant. A concept that was popularized by Du Bois, but actually not invented by Du Bois or started by Du Bois. And so, yeah, today we are here with Dr. Rasul Mowatt. What's up, man?
What's up? It's a pleasure.
And you are who again?
Who is you?
Yeah, Rasul Mowatt, professor at Indiana University in departments of geography and the Department of American Studies. Been there probably roughly about 15 to 16 years.
Okay. And you have prominent work on lynching in leisure studies particularly, right?
Yeah, so looking at mostly violence in public space, so the more contemporary white nationalists in public spaces. And but historically, my work starts with lynching history, and that's partly how I connect to this Willie Lynch Letter is the non-etymology or origin of the word coming from, this particular letter and person,
right,
or supposed person,
alleged person.
Exactly. And then presently working on a project that's just wrapping up, book part project on geographies of threat, cities of violence, just looking at a relationship between colonial and imperial cities on present day situations in which the conditions of oppressed people live within.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for being here with us. For those who have been loyal listeners of the show, Rasul was here back in May of 2020 when we did the myth that police killings and lynchings are the same. Essentially, there's important distinctions that should be made. Not going to get into details on that. If you want to know about it, go to our podcast page and listen to it. Speaking of, we also have a Patreon page that should be appearing right underneath me in the edit. Go to the Patreon page. You can support us for as low as $1, and it helps us start to pay our guests and just cover production costs and grow the show. So we'd appreciate that. And then you can just listen to the podcast on any of the major platforms. Again, it's the Black Myths podcast. So today the myth is the Willie Lynch Letter. Some people may have heard this, some people may have not. If you have not, you are a very lucky person. But if you have heard of the Willie Lynch Letter, you may have heard various things that it explains pretty much every predicament that we're in today as Black people, and all of the different intercommunal conflicts that have gone on. So we just want to give you a quick backdrop of what the letter was, or what the letter is, I should say. And we'll read a little bit of the letter as well. And then we're going to get into the history of it and the plausibility of it and so forth. So typically, the letter is explained as a slave master who was in the West Indies in 1712, who came up. His name is Willie Lynch or William Lynch, one of the two. He comes up to Virginia. They don't name the exact place in Virginia. They just say it's by the James River. We don't know the city or anything. It's not listed. Comes up to Virginia to help a series of slave owners who were having problems with their slaves, get a series of rebellions and things of that nature. And they were looking for a method to control their slaves. So he came up all the way from the West Indies and gave one short speech and went back home, apparently. But he came up and gave this speech and told the told these slave masters how to control their slaves, and he said it would last for 300 years, which we'll speak about even further later. The speech doesn't appear in popular culture at all until at least as early as 1970, and doesn't really appear in any sense where it's distributed widely until 1993. It was uploaded to a University of Missouri at St. Louis website by a librarian who, if you read the letter to people who had asked her about it, admits that it wasn't even real. She said, even as an inauthentic document, it says something about the former and current state of African America. So there is this breakdown between the myth of fact and myth of sentiment. So the facts are fairly clear that this letter is not real, but there's still people who believe in the sentiment. Yeah, there have been many people who have perpetuated the idea that it is actually a real letter and that somebody really did come up with this plan. If anyone has seen The Great Debaters, Denzel Washington gives a whole speech about Willie Lynch.
Anybody know who Willie Lynch was? Anybody? Raise your hand. No one? He was a vicious slave owner in the West Indies. The slave masters in the colony of Virginia were having trouble controlling their slaves, so they sent for Mr. Lynch to teach them his methods. The word lynching came from his last name. His methods were very simple, but they were diabolical.
Again, if The Great Debaters was based in, I think, the 30s, 1930s, and again, like I said, the letter was not noted of any form until 1970. So how this character, who was based on a real character, a union organizer for farmers, how he would have known about Willie Lynch is odd and probably not real. Rappers have used it. Talib Kweli.
How to Make a Slave by Willie Lynch is still applying.
One of my favorite poets, Black Ice, named his whole album The Willie Lynch Letter Is Dead. Here recently, Kendrick Lamar used it in his song Complexion.
Let the Willie Lynch theory reverse a million times with Complexion.
And who else was on that song? The rapper Rhapsody. And she just this past year posted this. She has since now taken it down for the record, but she posted on her Instagram, and in the comments she said, the Willie Lynch letter as he planned would last 300 years today, and we today are the shift. Somebody actually called her out in the comments, was like, nah, this isn't real. And she said nothing about the ideology is fake, and I don't believe it's fabricated. It may not be Willie, but it's the system created by someone. So again, we have this distinction between people who are like, yeah, maybe the letter's not real, but they were still saying some real, like that's still the sentiment. So just so for people who don't know what the letter is, I'm gonna read a portion of it, and then we're gonna get into the conversation. In 1995, in the Million Man March speech given by Louis Farrakhan, from Minister of the Nation of Islam, he quotes Willie Lynch in his speech.
Let's look at a speech delivered by a white slaveholder on the banks of the James River in 1712, 68 years before our former slave masters permitted us to join the Christian faith. Listen to what he said. He said, quote, "In my bag, I have a foolproof method of controlling black slaves. I guarantee every one of you, if installed correctly, it will control the slaves for at least 300 years. My method is simple. Any member of your family or your overseer can use it. I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves, and I take these differences and I make them bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes." I want you to listen. He said, "These methods have worked on my modest plantation in the West Indies, and they will work throughout the South." Now, take this simple little list and think about it. On the top of my list is age, but it's only there because it starts with an A, and the second is color or shade. There's intelligence, sex, size of plantation, status of plantation, attitude of owners, whether the slaves live in the valley or on a hill, north, east, south, or west, have fine hair or coarse hair, or is tall or short. Now that you have a list of differences, I shall give you an outline of action. But before that, I shall assure you that distrust is stronger than trust, and envy is stronger than adulation, respect, or admiration. The black slave, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry it on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. Now don't forget, you must pitch the old black male against the young black male, and the young black male against the old black male. You must use the female against the male, and you must use the male against the female. You must use the dark-skinned slave against the light-skinned slave, and the light-skinned slave against the dark-skinned slave. You must also have your white servants and overseers distrust all blacks. But it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us. They must love, respect, and trust only us. Gentlemen, these keys are your keys to control. Use them. Never miss an opportunity. And if used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you, gentlemen. End of quote. So spoke Willie Lynch 283 years ago.
Again, this letter tries to emphasize why Black people can't seem to come together. For what exactly, no one is ever quite clear on that part, but why why Black people can't come together. So yeah, as you can see, if you are not probably that informed, and somebody gives you a letter and says, this explains everything, then, maybe that will move you. There is more to that letter. There's a much more to that letter. I am not going to read it all. I'm going to pitch it to Tyrell so we can just get started on some of the flaws in it, and then we're going to come to Rasul for the main entree on it, just with the language and stuff.
All right, so yeah, some of the most obvious flaws of it, language. One, the word programmed he used earlier in the speech, that didn't enter the English language, at least with that connotation, until 1837.
The letter was in 1712.
Right.
So how did it get there? Could keep going. Just keep going. Yeah.
I can write it. In 1712, there was no region in the current day USA, United States, identified as the South. The geographical region of the South did not become distinct until a century after the alleged speech. Before the American Revolutionary War versus Britain, 1775 to 1783, the 13 original U.S. colonies were all slaveholding regions, and most of the colonies would later become the North, not the South.
So there was no South in 1712 because there was no America in 1712.
It was just the 13 colonies.
Yeah, got you. Next.
The word outline, that word, it had appeared only 50 years earlier, and at the time was only used in an artistic term, meaning like a sketch. It didn't convey its present meaning until 1753.
And
letter was 1712.
Yeah, got it. Anything else that we need to get off the
The letter uses the word nigger 47 times.
Oh wow. But go ahead.
Yeah. So it used the word nigger 47 times, but the word was not used in a derogatory fashion until at least 1755, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary.
So you mean like nigger hasn't been used since the beginning of time? Like it became a word at a certain point. So why would a word, and it was definitely used in derogatory manners within the letters. So you're telling me that that white folks hadn't even gotten around to this word yet in that sense?
No, they haven't. They weren't used. That wasn't it. That wasn't the term of fashion.
Yeah. And then a few other things, and then I'm coming to Rasul. He said his plan would last for 300 years, and he was from the West Indies. West Indies is also the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean there was like, I don't know, this thing called the Haitian Revolution that happens like within, I think, 70 years or so of the letter. At least it begins about 70 years or so, maybe about 75 years or so within the letter. 1791, do the math, ends in about 1803, I believe. So right. The guy from the West, he probably should have taken it back down there, because that's clearly where they were having the problems. In America, there was only one rebellion or revolt between 1700 and 1738, and that happened in New York. Subsequently, the same year as 1712, but why would he go to Virginia when the revolt was in New York? There were no other rebellions, though. He speaks in this letter as if the slaves were just turning up, and there's not any real evidence of that. So yeah, we're going to start with this myth of fact part. Just deal with the facts of the letter. We already dealt with some of the minor details, but just dealing with the facts of this. I don't know, as a researcher, how would you even start to verify this letter, Rasul? And you can just take it from here.
Well, it's just a matter of first, like, if you would want to verify. So, I know I'm saying that, and people may chuckle in listening to the podcast in that respect. But, I think the first point about research is what you're trying to research is not a confirmation of what is known or what you believe is known. It's trying to sort of explore what is unknown, right? You're trying to explain some type of phenomenon. And that's the case with any type of research, whether it's physics, whether it's looking at children in a daycare and looking at like behavior patterns, or is looking in archives. You're not looking for what you're trying to find some type of sense of missing information, filling out gaps. So what we know of slavery, there's plenty of information we have in the present day that helps to explain it in a number of different ways. And so there's not much in this particular letter that sort of brings something special to the table, and we can touch on a lot of that. But the context of the show, there may be researchers who look at literature, even if it's potentially false literature. There's people who look at media and media consumption who would sort of explore something like this. And so now you have to look in the archives. And of course, as you already outlined, it surfaces in the late 70s. I think it was 77 from what I remember.
I think it was actually the earlier 70s, but
72, right? Yeah. And then it comes down, and then it takes really off in the 90s, right?
Right.
So there's not a lot of discussion or chatter, from that 70 mention to the 90s. And we're talking about an era in which you had the Phil Donahue show and the Oprah Winfrey show. You have these classic episodes on their respective shows where you had Khalid Muhammad, and, you have avenues in which this probably would have been a part of popular discussion, just in that 70s to the 90s piece, but it's not even sort of touched on as a sort of panel conversation in that respect. But then, so that's one area of looking at is, where was it at in the 70s? And then how does it resurface, and why does it resurface in the 90s, right? And then you have to then backtrack to then look at, okay, 1712. Okay, how come there's no mention of the letter, this event, and Willie Lynch himself up into, the 70s? And so I know people have said that this letter sort of has so much importance, and so they had to sort of erase the tracks. And I know we'll try to talk about some more important meetings later on that are real, that have very real, implications, and that there's plenty of evidence of. But the fact is that there is no discussion of it. That means not only would you have to get rid of this letter, you would have to get rid of, the type of travel requests and hotel reservations that were made for all these plantation owners, the invitations to numerous plantation owners. You had to erase some sense of who he was to even have prominence to be requested to come up. So letters of correspondence asking, inviting him, up to speak, that would have to be erased. Besides his own record of holding, enslaved people down in some West Indies, West Indian Islands, because we don't know which one.
No,
right?
It's not referenced.
And so that would have to be erased. Then you would have to erase all other mention of him. And if he's so important, there would be lingering reference points. Like there'll be in 1730, somebody said, man, remember that meeting where we met Willie Lynch and he told us about whatever? Like, you would have to erase that, because we're talking about an era in which people are reading stuff that are constantly being made. 100 years, just over 100 years later, John C. Calhoun as a senator, and then eventually as the vice president, is reading Samuel Morton and Samuel Morton's work on craniology, right? And how Black people, right? The whole idea of skull sizes and intelligence. And he's saying on the floor of Congress how important Samuel Morton's work is. Samuel Morton was not present. He wasn't a guest of honor at Congress. This guy just read the book. And so people were referencing stuff in common language and discourse. And so you would have to erase that record. And so the fact is that there is no record of a William Lynch in this respect, a Willie Lynch, a Bill Lynch, or whoever, for all those years. I mean, that's a lot of erasing. That's skilled erasing, right? And when we say erasing, this is not deleting a digital file. This is finding and tracking down sheets of paper and letters that had to have been properly archived by a librarian or archivist to even be found to then get rid of. And there's been numerous systems of archiving, right, that has taken place since 1712. I mean, like, there's just, so I hope I'm answering, some of your questions, but I mean, these are just some of the things that you would have to do to prove its existence, or ask why it's important, or to now ask, why is it not present, right? And with just the preponderance of information that individuals like Jelani Cobb in the past have done, a great job with questioning, its sort of validity and, and evidence of it being real. Like, there's just simply no evidence of any of this. But even more importantly, and I think, what I always try to think about, there is just no evidence of the meeting itself, right? And just the records, the little minutia of records, the renting of horses, like I said, the catering bill for the food, all these little things would be done even then, right? Even then, there would be invoices for people's work, just to get these people there, just to make these people comfortable, to hold the meeting, to then lodge them afterwards. There would have been probably formally a dinner afterwards. That's just kind of the process then. And there would have been a record of how many turkeys or whatever was purchased for the dinner, right? And whoever's honor. But you all kind of get a sense of how I'm looking at disproving it is that there is a complete absence of evidence that sort of help even get a sense that not only is this person likely not real, but the letter was not real, nor a meeting was real.
Yeah, I mean, if you, I don't know, even this Zoom meeting, which is easier to track, but still, if there was something said in this meeting, I mean, I had to send out invites for y'all to get on Zoom, right? Like I had to, like, you know, Zoom is a digital company, so they track everything anyway. So there's gonna be a record if the police wanted to track something, if it was criminal, or whatever, they could find records of that. We have an outline for this show. We have correspondence about how we were gonna do this show. You know, with like that's just anything. We didn't just hop on Zoom randomly. You know what I'm saying? Like we had to prepare for this. And that's just anything that happens in the world that is an event that you don't just end up there. And I think when we talked about this before, like this isn't during the time of planes and you know, fast boats and or you know, this is like closer. It's not this old, but it's closer to like Game of Thrones where you're sitting like pigeons, you know, like it's much closer. Yeah. As far as correspondence, it's actually much closer to that. So
it would be weeks. It would be weeks for a letter. So that's I mean, so to just think about trying to set up a date, right? When is this going to happen? So it may take 6 weeks plus for a letter with the date that we have planned to get to Willie Lynch. And then Willie Lynch may look at the letter and the date and says, I can't do this date. And it will take 6 weeks to send a response back. And then it'll take another 6 weeks for people to say either, okay, we can do the date that you propose, or no, what about another date? So if they didn't want to do the date, that's another 6 weeks. So exactly, we're talking about just a correspondence time, much less a travel time. So him coming up was not like within a day, you know, or even a week, right? Like it would take him some time, because again, we don't know which island he's coming from. But yeah, I mean, there's so much around it. So, and I want to make sure people understand too that I'm coming at this again, just as a reminder, as a person who researches lynching and the etymology or origin of the word lynching was where I was coming to within this. And of course, there's no connection. But I always want to try to give people a sense that I am not an expert on Willie Lynch. I do not want to be a speaker on Willie Lynch. I am here to talk about it in the context of respect for the show. So, you know, this is not something to reach out to me to come and do a talk on, you know, in any future respect, you know, at all. You know, this is, you know, because it's so much energy to talk about something that there's more important things to talk about, right? Right. But not in the sense that we shouldn't do the show, but I'm just saying in the sense of, you know, like once we're done, right? Like, you know, and so why I always try to like tackle those logistical elements is that it moves us away from trying to go tit for tat with somebody who wants to believe it when we're trying to talk about the spelling of color and the use of the term Black, which are all evidence of it not being a good and factual, you know, letter. That's too much logic. So that's why I try to always think about like the other things around it. If it was real, there would be these other remnants of something, some other evidence, the logistics of doing this meeting, there would be evidence of it, and there's no record whatsoever.
There'd be way too big of a paper trail. If this really happened, there'd be way too big of a paper trail. Even to get rid of all of it, you couldn't get rid of all of it. And then for like it did not. Yeah, how could you, like, and for this not to resurface until what, 1970s, and this happened in
1712.
Yeah. Like you said, there'd be receipts for this, that, and the third. How many turkeys? How many this we had to order? You know.
And for a person who's supposed to be very important, so this person is supposed to be prominent. So this person's stature is so big it would be hard to hide his non-travel, much less hide the fact that he existed. It would be very hard, right? Because
People kept
the
whole thing.
yeah, exactly.
And the actual architects of racism, you know, to just kind of, you know, or the actual architects of racist ideas, I should say, or even racist practices, are known. So,
I mean, they signed their name on the plans or on the documents. I mean, which again, I do want to get to some of those.
That's kind of
at some point. But I mean, so. But I hope that kind of helps to explain to people. So my response is about the sheer logistics that sort of highlights the myth. Is something that is so important to keep in mind, right? That there's just no evidence of all of this, the correspondence, the coordination, who the invitees were, right? Like who were they? You know, and so I think that's an important piece to have in mind alongside then just references. I mean, you know, they talk about King James, and King James wasn't even the ruler of, you know, I mean, it was Queen Anne. Queen Anne is, you know, was the monarch of Great Britain, the newly formed Great Britain, because Great Britain had just come into being as Great Britain, you know, in 1707. You know, while King James was important with unifying England and Scotland, you know, she takes over it all, right? But yet King James is mentioned, somebody who has long been dead and whose rulership has long since ended. You know, and so there's that element. I know you already mentioned the New York Riot rebellion that happened in April of 1712, and there's no direct mention, which is something that would have happened because it was a significant rebellion. And so it would have been like, even on the banks of the so-called, you know, James River, it would have been some sense of, you know, hey, we have to keep in mind what happened just in April in New York, right? You would talk in that very sort of specific way.
That's what you're worried about, right?
That's right. And that's what we saw eventually later on with the Haitian Revolution, right? Like they would reference by name and by year these types of things. They wouldn't just sort of be like, oh, you know, that terrible incident that happened in that island. Like they outright said the Haitian Revolution or what happened in Haiti or those types of things. And so there are all those technical pieces that then we can get to after we sort of, you know, tease out that the sheer logistics and the absence of any record of any of this is so important, you know. And I know we'll get to some, you know, a lot of the aspects of the sentiment, right, which also is why Willie Lynch is elevated. But even the sentiments that, of course, he's conveying, there are other diaries of actual real slave masters that are created or drafted, you know, that are talking about the management of their plantations and things like that. But yet, you know, this mythical one is sort of elevated. I think this also begins to, as a segue, move into just, although we have all this great amount of information about slavery, we ourselves as people do not want to look into slavery, right? We do not want to study it in any respect. And so so the Willie Lynch Letter just fills in that particular gap. And so why I'm even bringing that sort of aspect up of it is that they're talking about a plantation system, right, of enslavement. And the interesting thing is that plantation, you know, slaveholding, of course, had already been in the colonies, but plantation slaveholding was just maybe 80 years old in the colonies, right? So, and that's in Virginia.
Can you explain that difference? Because I don't know if people are clear on that. Like when we think of slaves, we just think plantation. Like we don't
automatically.
Yeah. So can you kind of break that distinction down?
Yeah, I mean, of course, slaveholding means you literally, have this person in bondage, this free labor, and person is accurate. I mean, there are laws like the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 that actually uses the term person, right? So there's disagreement on writers about our humanity, right? And the usage of turning us not human takes on a lot of different sort of other important connotations that I'm sure we'll get to with sentiments. But slaveholding could be anything. It was errands, right? So it was janitorial duties in a fort. It was roofing, right? Building a roof on a hut. Or if you had a farm, just somebody who weeded, not a plantation, a farm. So a plantation system turns a farm, agricultural work specifically, into a more in line with a factory production model, right? So in terms of weight and hours, and these types of things are all sort of factored into, to the production of whatever you're making on the farm, as opposed to just growing, right? And tilling. Like you're literally you duplicate the numbers to duplicate the yield, to duplicate, what you actually produce as a crop, to duplicate your wealth, right? Like that's the whole idea. And so
that's the capitalist element of it.
Yeah. And it's a plantation. So, I mean, so what I'm saying is that 1613 is the first plantation in colonial, America, in Virginia. So yes, the location is correct, but that's just under 100 years, ago. But prior to that, the first plantation under British rule is in Ireland, the plantation of, Ulster in Northern Ireland. So this also gets into a sense that plantation systems were part of, were starting to develop as a part of British rule, and it was implemented in other locations first before it was in the colonies and on, African, enslaved people, right?
Right. So that's the the here lately has been quoted a lot, racial capitalism.
Racial capitalism. Yeah, exactly. So this, I mean, this is the one of the key evidence points that Cedric Robinson, while Cedric Robinson did not coin the term, he did incredible, excellent work with trying to sort of articulate this history.
Black Marxism, for anybody, Black Marxism, that's a book.
Yeah. And this notion that racial capitalism is dependent upon, you need a other, you need to make some population the other, the racial other, right? And so the Irish was the racial other for the sort of conquering and occupying, British, right? And they wanted to, just like they, like other, colonizing forces, dispossess people and extract resources, from their land and territory. And so they, created a plantation in 1606. So before there was any plantations in the colonies, that was already present in Ireland. I mean, there's a lot of things that Ireland, that British occupation of Ireland ultimately gives us. I mean, later on, it gives us policing, and,
right.
and other aspects too. But I think that's important for people to think about. And so Cedric Robinson sort of makes the point that before they ever talked about or thought about enslaving indigenous people first, in America, and then bringing over enslaved Africans, they were already enslaving Italians and, Irish and Eastern Europeans and various European, colonial powers first, because they had to make and find some other, right, to turn into a laborer or a worker for them.
This question of racialization, I think is kind of where I felt like it should go, because it's like
right.
What is one? I don't even know if people really know what racialization, like just the average person. This is no knock on them. Just like what is like racialization mean? Because I think we assume there's even though people say all the time race is a construct or social construct or whatever, you hear that thrown around. Like I don't think people still kind of think of themselves biologically or, endemically as a race. So that's not how people in the world used to see themselves once upon a time. So what is so to get to where we're at now, or even where, it starts to kind of occur. You were talking about in the mid 1600s, by the time we get to the 1712 of this letter, racialization is still happening. It's not done.
Right.
So what is that? What does that look? What is racialization, and then what is it? What's kind of how does that process occur?
Yeah. So a lot of forces, a lot of things are happening at this time, right? So it's the 1700s. Capitalism is developing, but it's really coming out of the age of mercantilism, and these wealthy merchants, bankers, and so on, who are financing these explorations, gaining wealth, and the various sort of monarchies want to also accumulate their wealth, and beyond where they already currently control, they are now going to outside, other lands. So it's transitioning, right? Feudalism has transitioned to mercantilism. Mercantilism transitioned to, capitalism, right? And if people aren't familiar with feudalism, just think about, kings and queens over lands, serfs who are working on lands for no particular, form of pay.
No upward mobility whatsoever.
No upward mobility. Fixed. There's a caste system, a true caste system fully in effect, where the monarchy are divinely ruling. So people's children are going to always be the rulers over these people. There is a wealthy landowner base that isn't even at the very top, who are just sort of, ensuring that they never go back to being serfs, and then there's, in most cases, the church, who's another financial backer or partner to the crown. And soon
to be slavery. Yeah.
And soon to be slavery, right, exactly. So feudalism is, has given way to mercantilism. Mercantilism is now still in this process of giving way to capitalism, right? And so racial capitalism, and in the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is capitalism, right? It's not a type of capitalism, it is capitalism. And so what racial capitalism has to do, has to turn people into not only something other than the people who are oppressing them, but it also has to convert these people to a extracting exploitive source for labor, but also extracting source for resources. So they have to dispossess them. So in terms of Spanish crown, there was a process of what they call, I think the correct pronunciation is reducir, so reduction, right? So you have to take the indigenous person and turn them into a subject. All right. So you have to dispossess them from the land that they live on, remove them from it, create your city, and then bring them back onto the land, and and make them live inside your city, but now as a subject, right? And so they're living now within this new territory on top of the lands in which they once lived on, but now as this tax-paying laborer or enslaved person, and that's racial capitalism, and that's technically racialization, because that's what racial capitalism does. It has to racialize these populations of people, and who they're racializing is arbitrary, depending upon where and what time and what period, what century, and what are the resources they wish to extract. If I hope that sort of is clear, yeah. and so racialization then eventually gets more and more sophisticated, right? Where you need helpful arguments to convince the everyday population, right? And who are the everyday population? Everybody who can read or have some sense of the word. So for the crown and for the church, this becomes like great magazine reading, right? It's just something to just help explain what they're already doing and give them ideas for how to expand it. For the property owner, it gives them some means to maybe invest more money into the process. And then for a commoner who's been turned into a worker, a laborer, they're like, oh, there's a station worse than me. Like, I want to make sure that that station, remains below me. Like, I know I'm in a bad situation, but as long as I don't have to be in that bottom situation, I'm good. So even though, I may be poor, at least I'm still English, right? I'm still English though, right? And that's the point of racialization, is get that sort of support from all those levels, towards the process. And so first, racialization is explained through the church, because the church is explaining everything. The church is a source of education. So if you're wealthy enough, you went to a monastery to learn from monks or whomever, right? But during this time is the Enlightenment, where they're breaking from the church or the church dominated rule or role. And so
they're claiming to be moving towards a claim to be moving towards a more scientific perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So science is now going back to explain all the things that religion was explaining. And so by this particular point in time, just before it, probably late 1600s, you have the sort of religious scientists who are no longer quoting scripture about people's complexion and temperament and trying to talk about climate, right? So you have the religious climate scientists who are suggesting, the further south from the equator you go, the temperaments are hotter and the skins are darker, right? And that sort of helps to explain the distinctive difference in that respect.
And white people are the original because the original people were white, but the people who were there was different. There was, I guess, I don't want to get too into
debate. It was debates between people. Exactly. I mean,
it was different
ideas.
Yeah, it was like what was it, like Mongolism and polytheism or something like that. And one was like, did human beings originate from one source? And the polytheism, I think is what, I don't know if I'm saying that word correctly, was like where did human beings come from different, like were they like animals where you have like literal different breeds of even breeds, like actual different categories of creatures, like so even that wasn't a clean conversation either, where everybody's just white and black. Like they debated this, right? Like,
well, I think that's the important point, is that these are debates, and so that means there's three of us here on this line for this podcast show. All three of us may have our person in the dogfight in terms of whose theories we like the most.
Right.
These things were a part of that, and that's I guess that's an important point to what we're talking about here, is that there wouldn't be just this one position on managing enslaved population from somebody called Willie Lynch. Everybody's like, oh, this is great. This is the only thing that we're going to do. It would be like, there would be some people who were Willie Lynch people, and there would be somebody who is, other people, right? And I know I've alluded to other people, but I just want to make sure people have a sense that there's a horrible but good content diary, the diary of Bennett H. Barrow, who is a slave master who talks about the rules of plantation, right? So there would be a debate between, so we would have that sort of understand. There wouldn't be just one. And then there's Thomas Thistlewood, and there's a diary of Thomas Thistlewood, who's from Jamaica, who has agricultural techniques that he lays out, right? And this is 1748 for Thomas Thistlewood, and Barrow is 1833. So Barrow comes later, but Thistlewood would be technically a contemporary of supposed Willie Lynch. And that means that there will be debate amongst these two supposed prominent individuals. And if it's not a formal debate in some type of lecture hall at a university, it would have been at least debate in the public sphere, right? No different than today with Facebook posts or whatever else. Yeah, it'll be people who are like, but Thistlewood said this, and but Lynch said this, and these types of things.
Right,
and
right. It wouldn't just be. There was too much. There was too many. There was too much. Too many ideas being exchanged for it to just be like, Willie Lynch.
We're just gonna take this. We're just gonna take this
Especially,
guy.
especially if it's the guy who let the Haitian Revolution happen. It's like so. It's just just like.
Yeah, and when you read these diaries and compare them to this Willie Lynch letter, you kind of see how bad the Willie Lynch letter is even more, because these diaries are so prescriptive in management of a plantation. Like no person shall be married, right? No person shall be married beyond the plantation. No driver of a coach can leave the plantation without permission and without accompaniment of the family of the plant. I mean, like
that's much more specific than dark skin, light skin. Because if you read that and you try to think about how do you apply that on a plantation,
you can't.
I think we did, for the listeners, there's a secret episode we did on this that we never released, but we used the analogy of like an HR department or something. And how if an HR department comes to your job and it's just like, y'all need to do this, and then they just left, you wouldn't have any clue how to implement that into your actual day-to-day work. Like they'd have to give you trainings and really break it down for you. Because again,
I think a real example is, some of us are working places that have had the horrible sexual harassment video that they show us, and like, like somebody push play and they leave, and we're watching this and we wonder why sexual harassment happens in the workplaces, because this video does not provide any specifics on what we should be attentive to, right? What is and what isn't, right? And all these types of things. So, I think your point is there, right? Like there is no prescription. And again, when you compare it to these other individuals' diaries, there's plenty. These slave masters enjoyed writing and philosophizing, right? They love it. So there are plenty of, diaries from these folks. There, during this century that Willie Lynch is supposed to exist, there's actually the creation of actual true race science, right? Yeah. Comes about in the same century. Carl Linnaeus in 1735 is the first person that devises, he's a botanist, first person who devises a way in which we think, we're supposed to think about people as being separate species. Human beings are now separate species, right? And he breaks down that there's 4 different species with different characteristics. And then from there, it sets off like wildfire, where people are debating and they're coming up with their version of Carl Linnaeus's point. So Carl Linnaeus is the first person, right? And so it is through his argumentation that we then get into this whole idea of inheritability, of intelligence and aptitude. And then that can turn into psychological studies on people, right? I heard on one of you all show, you talk about Samuel Cartwright, drapetomania.
Yeah.
If there's no Carl Linnaeus, there's no Samuel Cartwright, right? Because it needed science, right? So Carl Linnaeus begins this lineage of all of these ideas to expand, these concepts and points. Because remember, I also mentioned earlier in the show that John C. Calhoun says on the floor of Congress, how much Samuel Morton, another individual in 1823, roughly to like 1851, who does all those skull studies, right? How important his research was to showing and proving why slavery is the right thing for enslaved people and the right thing for the United States. So this is how popular these ideas are, but they don't really take off about people in the as a process of racialization until Carl Linnaeus, because Carl Linnaeus You know, you got the pamphlets that people are duplicating and they're passing it to their friend. He's giving lectures. You know, people are wrongly quoting his lectures or rightly quoting their lectures, just like today. And it's all from there. I mean,
you got Blumenbach, and that's where
and it comes
Caucasian and Caucasoid and all that comes from.
So in terms of just trying to think about ways in which you can read real history, you know, you can read real science, you can read real struggle that talks about the issues of a certain type of mentality. Frantz Fanon and Wretched of the Earth talks about the colonial mentality and the colonized mind, but not in the spirit of the Willie Lynch Letter and the readers of the Willie Lynch Letter that says we shouldn't care about Black people, because that's usually the intent. And I thought in the age of at least Black Lives Matter, Black lives supposed to matter. And
Right.
and so, you know, like so if somebody is just not, you know, doing what needs to be done, you're supposed to continue to do that work. And Fanon instead doesn't abandon the colonized minded person. He's trying to treat them, because remember, he's a psychologist. And I mean, like, but we have real struggle examples that occur all after the letter that points to, you know, people are clearly not acquiescing to enslavement.
I was gonna say, maybe I'm not understanding, or I'm not catching it. How did this letter become just like our go-to for that? Like, when we had all these other diaries, maybe people just weren't researching, but we from like you said, this is like stuff you can easily Google. You can Google now, but back then, like you said, or you just said, like, they would philosophize about this, which means they talked to each other. They gave different tips and, you know, not motivations, but just different tips and, you know, different ways of doing things. To whereas all of a sudden we get Willie Lynch Letter, and that's the one we just run with.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great question, Troy. I mean, so I think as a researcher, that's the question that I would ask and try to explore. And for me, that would have to go back to, why does this surface in the 70s? And then why does it surface again in the 90s? Because it's clear that since there's no evidence of it being a real letter, it's someone either wrote it definitely in the 70s, so there's a definite evidence point that it was written in the 70s, or somebody didn't write in the 70s and somebody did craft it in the 90s and posted it online, right? And so we have to
she admitted it wasn't real. Like, that's the thing. That
exactly. Yeah. And so,
just to make this clear for the listeners, the person who posted this online, posted this online admitted it was not a real letter.
The first person who posted on. So the reason why we have it online is because of this person, right? And so to answer your question, I would have to then get into, was this letter crafted with a purpose of being some type of criticism, right? And not with the intention of it being like a real letter from then, but just like, in the spirit of, if I was a slave master from 1712, it's clear that, from all these years, we still carry the legacy of slavery and our sort of inability to come together and that type of thing. And so that's not something I can sort of jump to a conclusion with, or I feel jump into the conclusion with as a researcher. But that to me is what will probably be uncovered, doing interviews, going to the library in St. Louis. Can I get a hold of that old computer, that it was uploaded on, let me see that floppy, disk or whatever, and those types.
She also says that the person who she said she's going to let the person who gave her that letter, she said they shall remain anonymous. They want to remain anonymous. Yeah. That was her claim. So we still don't know who she got it from.
Right.
That part's not known.
They could have wrote that.
Yeah. So I mean, so it was probably serving that purpose of a frustration, criticism on what somebody was perceiving as the state of Black America, right? And I'm not trying to make light, because I have no idea of what the person's intent, but that was probably, I mean, how it reads and how it looks, it does seem like that. again, as a researcher, I cannot say that without a doubt. I have no evidence of that. But your question is what would start me to look, and no longer look at 1712 or something older, but look at the 70s or the 90s as why was this letter made then? Or why did this letter come to being then? And then who made it during then? And what was the sort of purpose or sentiment, right? Were they speaking to things specific to their city and the politics within their city? Or were they trying to do just cast it more general? So the scope of it, because it also shows, even if that's true, that there is even then a lack of understanding of slavery, because stuff like the Diary of Bennett Barrow, that was evidence then, right? It's easier for us to search for it today, everyday people, but it was evidence then, right? And I know I've talked with other people, and there's people who looked at slavery and slave records, getting their PhD in 1890s, right? Like 1880s, right? And I don't know how they did it, because there was no searching, great searching mechanism. It was just
shout out to the boys. Shout out to
exactly. So you walk into a room and the librarian says it's somewhere in here, right? And you literally have to look in this whole room to try to find something that may be relevant to you. And that means this is probably going to be the whole year that you're going to look in this whole room to find stuff in. And so the closer we get to the present is when we start having maybe better systems for our archives. And so I remember, looking through archives in the 90s, and it wasn't great. It was a bad computer that you would type in some words, and most of the time, like, you would come up with no records, and you would get the archive pass, and it's on this floor, and you would just try to have at it, just try to go through stuff. Now you have online systems, but even then, online systems never encompass everything that's in the back of these archives. Like, there's literal real people, and so shout out to librarians and archivists who digitize this stuff, find it. Because so when you don't see them, when they're not coming up to the counter and answer your question, they're busy in the back digitizing the next document, trying to find whatever that has not been cataloged and giving it a new catalog, which is just incredible, which is also helpful for us in many different ways. I know it seems like we're jumping. I don't want to, and I hope we're not.
Good. We're good. And I was gonna...
But I think some other key points before we even get to sentiment is that, like you said, 300 years, and they're talking about 300 years of being a colony in the midst of a century in which they're going to break for independence. So there has to be, during the 1700s, even in 1712, some sense of being disgruntled at paying taxes to the crown. So why would they want to have 300 years? Because I know readers aren't thinking about the time frame. So readers are thinking, oh yeah, this is real, because 300 years later, we're still like this.
Right.
Not thinking that the audience of Willie Lynch are a group of plantation owners. So they're saying that they're comfortable with 300 years of, yes, making money off of enslaved people, but also having to pay taxes to a crown.
Right.
I don't know. That does not make any sense, especially in the midst of, politically, like, why would you want, again, there was already disgruntledness amongst a widespread group of landowners in France, in Germany, in Spain, in Britain.
Right.
And that's the basis for a lot of early stuff. So when they're talking about society in the letter, they're talking about British society. They're not talking about United States. They're talking about British society.
Right. And there was no that, I think that's an important point. As far as we're talking about the British, these were competing powers at the time. This wasn't a solved question of, like you said, the United States. Like, we have to remember how the United States formed. It's theft, So I'm saying, like, the Mexican-American War hadn't been fought yet. at the time of this letter, they don't have Texas, and you know, again, none of this stuff exists. You know, the Louisiana Purchase hadn't happened, which was prompted for the record by Haiti, by the Haitian Revolution, because they were losing, because the French were losing money after they lost their plantation. So you know, none of these things had occurred. And then there were like different, I was looking through the book American Slave Codes. There were just different forms of specifically under like the different I guess ethnic backgrounds, whether it was English or French. There were different plantation concepts. So like what was called, Jacob M. Price referred to it as a Latin model. This form of slavery was, it said, protected the integrity of plantation by treating slaves as immovable assets or real estate, which would not be separated from plantation as a whole. And this was prominently practiced by the Spanish, Portuguese, and the French territories. So this is to say that slaves are like homes, or like, is it like land? It stays put, and you don't break up your families. Like that was their form of practice. And so families actually stay together under that type of slavery. And that's why that's arguably why in other places outside of a so-called America, or what as we know as United States, there were probably more rebellions because people got closer in some cases. But then like with the Anglo, there was the Anglo model, and it said protected the creditor by treating slaves as chattel or disposable personal property like furniture, and allowed the dismantling of a plantation for the instant conversion of its labor force into cash, breaking family relations among enslaved whenever it was financially expedient. So the Anglo-Saxon model, that primarily aligns more so with the British, was about breaking up families and selling them down the rivers. So when you come back to the letter, and he talks about the woman needs to raise her child, the nigger slave needs to raise their child to be you know, for the male slave to be dependent upon her, to make him weak, and the female slave to be independent and not depend on her. This all assumes that they get to raise their children, but under the Anglo-Saxon model, these kids got sold off. Like a lot of times, they didn't even get raised by their mothers. So
I mean, and if we talk about the West Indies, British, I mean, if you just look at the histories, I mean, C.L.R. James does a great job in Black Jacobin, talk about, you know, the conditions of Haiti before the Haitian Revolution. You know, and that's under French, like not even the British, right? The Anglo model, but just the conditions of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean are so brutal. And, you know, once in terms of, yes, the slave owners, but also the weather, right? And the disease. I mean, they're talking, I mean, and the different islands, like hundreds of thousands, like just like COVID-19, were killing people, and they just had to like they had to bring in an extra 250,000 within the same year just to replace the 100,000 they lost, you know. And so when they're talking about us in society, they're talking about British society. And if this is supposed to be prominent as an idea, then it's supposed to be prominent as an idea for all types of plantations and all types of enslavement. So why him, and why the meeting here in Virginia, as if this is the most and only important place of British plantation rule? I mean, 1604, British is in Guyana. You know, 1627, they're in Barbados. 1633, they're all up in India, right? And there's enslaved populations all in these particular colonies, right? There's a combination of both free labor and unfree labor, right? And free labor is, of course, slavery, but unfree labor are people who are forced to have to work a wage, right? They have to do this, or by law will be placed into prison. And so technically, this person, if he's so important, would be the most prominent of all of these places.
Yeah, everything we've talked about, yeah.
Because again, we're not talking about United States. And I think when people are reading it, which still stays within, I think, the question that Tyrell asked, I think it speaks to this sense of just not a desire to read about slavery at all. This notion of before Black unity, there's also the narratives of people who were running as running the Underground Railroad. And we have diaries of them, the Black people who were heavily involved in it. So William Steele, Philadelphia, was a conductor for the Underground Railroad. Diary, 1852. And uniquely in his diary, it isn't just like his experiences, it's his experiences in trying to get these people to freedom, right? And just talking about just the ordeals and how unique they are and how important they are as human beings, as people, and so on. It's a remarkable piece. And even when we think about, 12 Years a Slave, where the movie really sort of suffers, is that the book doesn't end with him just coming home. He comes home and realizes how horrible his life was for those years, but how lucky he was he got out. Right. And then he commits the rest of his life to doing public speaking to assist in the abolition work. And so the whole closing part of his book is about his abolitionist turn, because what's evident is that he lived a life of luxury, respectability, and arrogance before being kidnapped, right? Knowing full well that there are people who are like him that's being enslaved, he didn't care about them. He was busy playing the violin and, enjoying the life until he got captured, right? And then for 12 years he goes, but yeah, the whole end of the book is this full-scale commitment to, doing an abolitionist work. And it's an incredible closure. And, and that's unfortunate the movie sort of just closes with. But
I thought we couldn't get along. I thought the plan that Willie Lynch said that, we
right.
that you pit us against each other and it'll work for 300 years. And, according to people who promote this letter, that's the case. We can't get along. So how do you reconcile that with Black abolitionists or not, let alone, Nat Turners or people like how do you reconcile it with that? Or do you?
Well,
reconcile it?
if we're not reckoning with our political reality, do we need to ever get along? And so to me, so to me, it's the sense, I know this is just so horrible and hard, I know, you're fine with it, but I know listeners will be like, damn, but, it's this notion of as if there is this sort of set social agreement that we have amongst each other of just the head nods in a movie theater or something like that, as if we're just constantly in this sort of headspace of being together, right? And no, if I see you and I don't know you, I don't know you, right? There is no, why do we have some sense of, because if there was, we don't have some sense of unity just by nature of being alive and walking around. And even if we know that we have this shared history, there's still no basis of it, because by acknowledging the history, we're moving towards a sense that there's a political reason that we're supposed to acknowledge each other. And if we could go to that, then now we have to then recognize, what are we doing in relationship to our political reality? And so are we engaging in struggle, or are we just engaging in Facebook post struggle? Right. And so if we're engaging in an actual struggle, trying to meet the needs of our people, whether it's in the dispossession of housing and food and these types of things, that work is always supposed to be hard and it's always frustrating. People are going to cuss you out at the food kitchen, right? People are going to, not appreciate your work for 5 years. And finally on the 6th year, they'll be like, oh, thank you. Right.
Right.
And that's just the hard road of doing that type of work. So to me, when people are talking about sentiments, they're talking about somehow not trying to confront the political reality, and we're just supposed to be in social agreement about something.
And that something is always vague. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know.
So it's as if we're supposed to, three of us have our mask on and we're trying to eat some food, and the server who is also quote unquote Black, right? And I say quote unquote Black because for me, I didn't always think about Black as a political identity and not a social identity, right? And so the person who is Black supposedly going and taking their time, submitting the order, and we never get our food, and we're supposed to just look at each other, Willie Lynch, right? As if, like this is an explainer of bad Black behavior conduct, and there's some Black pathological reason why we don't do well or do right by one another, because the context always are non-political things. It's the reason why, we don't respect our elders, or elders don't respect, young people. It's the reason why only in hetero relationships we don't love each other or respect each other, because definitely the letter has some anti-queer tones to it, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the spirit of it. The spirit of it that people are talking about, they apply it to these non-political realities. They never are bringing up Willie Lynch Letter as it relates to a political reality. They're never sitting. I'm not saying I would respect it, but maybe I am saying I respect it, right? Like I'm incarcerated, and and one of the correction officers is Black, and they beat me, and I just look at my cellmate Willie Lynch, right? Like, in that respect, that would play into one, what the letter is literally saying, the context the letter is actually situated in, and matching the context probably of what I'm describing that I'm in. But most of the time, what we're trying to adapt it to is why we don't get along at some corporate job, why do we don't get along in our sort of, loving relationships. And it speaks to some sense that we're not actually engaged in political struggle work, or don't want to. And because part of it also in looking at slavery and truly looking at it, we'll see that Willie Lynch was never needed, nor a speech. When Harriet Tubman describes being hit by a 2-pound weight at the age of 12, that knocked her unconscious and gave her dizzy spells for the rest of her life, I think that is sufficient enough of a thing to keep me doing work on a plantation, for some time, right? Like, you don't need some psychological manipulation. Like, no, you always gonna remember that 2-pound weight that you were hit with and knocked senseless, right? And so slavery was slavery, and it was enough to do the effect, but the effect wasn't acquiesce, because I think that also speaks to people's perception that not only was there just this long gone with the wind plantation for centuries, it was also that we just went with it. And historical record shows there are umpteen riots and rebellions and insurrections. I mean, as early as 1536 off the coast of what will become South Carolina, like as early as that, like there isn't any of that. And then there's organization development. I mean, we're talking about early back to Africa movements of Black people, Black people in 1840s.
Yeah.
Right. Henry Highland Garnett and these types. I mean, like, we're thinking in levels and doing things that defy this sense of lack of unity, because people are coming together because they're facing their political reality, right? They're, as what we're saying, and keeping in line with, my other two sort of speakers for this month for your show, in a Marxist tradition, and looking at, the material relations and the social relations in which we live in, they're trying to deal with that and tackle that. And we did come together, and we have always come together in relationship to that. But if we're not coming together for that, there really truly is no reason. And so, and this is no different than when we know of the history, right? Black people were not unified on the continent of Africa. There was different empires because there are different people, there are different ethnic groups, there were different languages, different regions, right? Like we come together because of a political reality in which we face. And so this like myth of Black unity always sort of speaks to an inability for all of us to sit in some type of mega church and listen to, Kyrie Irving give a preach a sermon, like, why can't we come together, right? And no one comes together. No one comes together if it's not about their political reality. No one, and I try to push back on like ways in which we slip up into that myth of Black unity. Right? We talk about the Black community. Well, what's that? Could you tell me where that is? What is the actual Black community? Right? I know what's happening to a group of Black people who are unhoused. And by nature of their experience, they're sharing a common interest. But outside of that, I clearly don't care about those people who are, unhoused. I ain't doing nothing for them, right? Like we fall into that space of that because I think there is a desire to kind of not confront our political history and also engagement in political struggle. But the people who are most impacted by that reality is where the work is, right? And that work is always going to be thankless. It's going to be horrible. There's aspects of yourself that you're going to confront that you're not going to like, and there's aspects of others that you're going to confront that you're not going to like. Deal with some ingrained mentality from 1712. It just happens to do with the fact of sometimes being afraid, being afraid to give up stuff like your comfort, being afraid of, think about it. If I went to try to help, work with people who are trying to challenge their rent, and I convince them, if we collectively don't pay rent, we can put pressure on the property owner, which is technically true, right? And it's been successful. But who's going to be the first person to do that? Everybody's not going. Because the first person going to do that is going to be by themselves for at least a week, if not a month or two. And who's going to take that risk of being that one person who in the meeting said yeah, and now are kicked out because no one else said yeah. And so that's a real reality. There's fear that comes up. And that has nothing to do with some ingrained mentality from 1712. That's just, again, a part of struggle. Struggle is not easy, and it's about confronting, these types of choices. But to me, the Willie Lynch Letter actually is about an explanation of why not to struggle. Like, to me, that's what it sort of really is about. It's about, reading something and always having in the back of your pocket this thing that you can sort of pull out and say, this is why we can't do something. And so since we can't do something, I'm just going to go ahead and enjoy this other thing. And this other thing, of course, is capitalism, right? And the political reality of capitalism. So it's this thing that it's inevitable for us to not get along. It's inevitable for us to ever stand up. It's inevitable for us to never be able to challenge a system. So why do it? Because this is what's going to happen to you, because it's a part of us. But I do want to just mention some other examples. I know we mentioned Monroe Doctrine in 1823. There's the Berlin Conference in 1885 that is known as the Scramble for Africa, and that is a full-blown series of meetings, right, that result in partitioning up and dividing up the continent of Africa. That is way more important for people to be like, sitting in some restaurant and getting that bad check-ins and they're saying Berlin Conference, right? Like that's like
right. Like, is there? I guess because the thing about the letter is it's this grand. It's assumed it's this grand conspiracy. If you're looking for that, for the listeners, he's giving you. I'm not saying these are even grand conspiracies, but I'm saying like these are much closer to how you conceive that letter.
Right, exactly. And these are things that actually have destroyed us, right?
Yeah.
And destroyed people, have dispossessed people. So Berlin Conference, 1885, Monroe Doctrine, 1823, the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815. So over that entire year, they had a series of meetings, and that was all about expansion of colonialism and, you know, and enslavement, right? They're like, this is where I'm going to get my enslaved people, and this is where you're going to get your enslaved people, you know, and this is where we'll take them, like an agreement in that respect. Manifest Destiny, that was all about U.S. expansion, you know, increasing dispossession of indigenous populations, which we don't acknowledge, you know, in any respect, and our involvement in both their dispossession and our further dispossession, you know, 1812. We don't talk enough about the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which clearly Willie Lynch was not an expert on, you know.
Right.
And then to me, you know, in relationship to my book project, you know, the laws of the Indies that pretty much set up and design what the modern day city looks like, both in terms of the city grid structure, but ultimately how people are supposed to function within a city. And that's in 1542. It's compiled in 1680. And that document to me is the most sort of glaring document. But then we can sort of think about, you know, more modern day examples. I mean, in St. Louis, 1907, you have the St. Louis Planning Commission. I think it was called the Civic League of St. Louis, and they devised the first and most insidious zoning policy plan that ultimately then results in, like 30 years later, the complete dispossession of 20,000 Black people, you know, from their homes that they had built into other parts of St. Louis. And then they eventually placed them into public housing, which they then eventually demolish.
20,000.
But that is a real thing,
20,000 people, man. That's not, I don't think, that's a lot of people to displace, man. I mean,
in physical homes. And so people who are familiar with St. Louis, you know, it's like when you get off the train, there's this massive like open public space. That's the Mill Creek area that they dispossessed people because they just didn't want to see Black people in the center part of the city anymore. We were too smelly, too noisy, or whatever else. And they still, I mean, it's not a built up location. So it's not like they replaced it with an amusement park. It's still like pretty much an open square, you know. I mean, there's some other buildings there, but not a lot. And I mean, and then there's the whole Baltimore racial covenants in 1910. I mean, these are real documents that have had real impact. And of course, there's COINTELPRO. I mean, there's so many real things that we could spend ages on why we're impacted by them.
And when we're out eating, to your analogy, we could quote all those things, and it would make more sense. Yeah, or when we get pulled over by the police, or you know, we could quote
COINTELPRO.
Yeah.
We say that, but nope, we don't think in this particular way.
I think it was important to flesh out slavery, though, because I think one of my biggest problems with it is it gives us a misunderstanding of slavery. And I think that's crucially something that needs to be destroyed. Like we can't be out here, you know, understanding slavery is just a simple game of pitting people against each other and then they never fight back. Like that's not how this works. Like Black people, as we've already said several times, Black people, Africans, however you want to label it, like there's always been a pushback. Like Kwame Ture said, since the moment we hit the soil, you know, there's always been a fight, and even today, there's always been a fight. Like some of us have always been fighting. So this idea that we've collectively given up on ourselves because we have some, you know, deep psychological like hold in our heads. Like, yeah, some things are influenced by slavery, of course. Nobody's denying that. But but there are also has also been life that has been lived since slavery. That also influences things like you're talking about with rent, or even when this whole thing about Black men and women in relationships, like there's contemporary things that explains whatever you want to describe as our problems that aren't related to slavery, you know, or at least not directly. So
that's right.
So yeah, I think we're good unless Tyrell or Dr. or Rasul, if there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think, just to quote the title of, Stuart Hall, a scholar who I always respect, but to quote a book, just the book title as just a closing point, it's a hard road to renewal.
Tyrell.
Oh man, that's it right there.
Yeah, this is a good episode, though. I mean, yeah, I appreciate you for coming on and giving us the history. I think it's really important, again, that we just understand the premise of the whole show. Like, if you're moving and organizing around things that are completely false, like, you're gonna find yourself back in the same problem you were trying to get away from. So
yeah, right.
you have to you have to have a correct analysis, and I think we got that today. So thank you. Once again, shout out to the Center for Black Literature and Culture and the Indianapolis Public Library. Specifically, shout out to Miss Nichelle Hayes, who was really big in helping us put this together. And then we'll be back one more week with Dr. Olin Dodson, and we'll be discussing a local myth. The myth being that Unigov was good for Black Indianapolis. That Unigov is a policy that was imposed in 1970. We won't get any more into it right now. And it didn't have good effects on Black people in Indianapolis. So yeah, we'll be talking about that next week. And then we will also have a follow-up Zoom meeting with our co-hosts and whoever wants to participate. And you all, whoever has been watching and listening, can interact with us on that. That will be sometime early in March. So thank you again. We'll see y'all next week. Peace out.
All right, well, if you made it this far, we appreciate you, and please support the Black Myth Podcast. Go check out our Patreon, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, all social medias, all streaming platforms. Thank you.